May 12, 1945, 6:30 in the morning. A railway siding near the village of Ashwell. The morning mist hung low over the platform as the freight train hissed to a stop. Inside the wooden carriages, 200 German soldiers sat in silence. They'd been at war for 6 years. Now they were prisoners on enemy soil, exhausted, hungry, and uncertain what awaited them. Through the slats, they could see green fields stretching toward the horizon, so different from the bombed cities and muddy trenches they'd left behind. The door slid open. British guards gestured them out. One by one, they climbed down onto English ground. What happened next would echo across decades in ways none of them could have imagined. The men expected shouting, perhaps beatings. They'd heard stories of what happened to prisoners. But the guards simply formed them into lines and began walking them down a narrow country lane. Hedgerows bloomed with hawthorn. Birds sang. The air smelled of rain and fresh earth. It felt impossibly peaceful. At the edge of the village, farm workers stopped their labor to watch the column pass. The Germans kept their eyes down, bracing for hatred. Instead, they heard nothing. No jeers. No curses. Just the sound of boots on gravel and the distant lowing of cattle. By 1945, Britain had taken in hundreds of thousands of German and Italian prisoners of war. The camps were overcrowded. Food was scarce everywhere. But Britain's farms were critically short of workers. Most young men were still overseas. The Women's Land Army had done remarkable work, but the harvest couldn't wait. So the government made a decision that shocked many. Send prisoners to work the fields. Let enemy soldiers help feed the nation they'd tried to destroy. In Ashwell, the prisoners were billeted in a requisitioned manor house on the outskirts. The building was draughty and cold, but it had a roof and beds. That first night, they were given soup and bread. Not much, but more than some had eaten in weeks. A few of the older men wept quietly. They'd survived the war. Now they just wanted to survive the peace. The next morning, farmers arrived to collect their assigned workers. Thomas Whitley was among them. He was 62, his back bent from decades of labor, his hands gnarled as tree roots. He'd lost a son at Dunkirk. His nephew had been killed in North Africa. When the official told him he'd be assigned 4 German prisoners to help with the spring planting, Whitley said nothing. He simply nodded and led them to his truck. The drive to his farm took 15 minutes. Nobody spoke. The Germans sat in the back, watching the countryside roll past. Whitley's farm was modest, 100 acres of arable land and a small dairy herd. His wife had died 2 years earlier. He managed alone now, with occasional help from neighbors. When they arrived, he pointed to the barn, the tools, the field that needed ploughing. One of the Germans, a man named Klaus Richter, stepped forward. He was 31, thin as a rail, with hollow eyes. In careful, broken English, he asked what Whitley wanted done. Whitley looked at him for a long moment. Then he said they'd start with the north field. He showed them the plough, the harness for the horses. Richter nodded. He'd grown up on a farm in Bavaria. He knew this work. The other 3 were city boys, clumsy with the equipment, but Richter taught them. By midday, they'd turned 3 acres. Whitley watched from the gate, surprised. They worked hard, no complaining, no shirking. At noon, Whitley's daughter Margaret arrived with lunch. She was 18, fair-haired, cautious. She'd been 15 when the war started. She'd grown up hearing about the enemy, about what they'd done. Now here they were, sitting on her father's field, eating bread and cheese she'd packed. She set the basket down without a word and walked back to the house. But she'd seen their faces. They looked tired. Young. Not like monsters. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. The prisoners arrived at dawn. They worked until dusk. Whitley paid them nothing directly. That wasn't allowed, but he made sure they ate. Sometimes Margaret brought extra food. Sometimes Whitley himself sat with them during breaks, sharing tea from a flask. Conversation was limited by language, but gestures sufficed. Richter began to teach the others English words. Plough, seed, rain. Whitley learned a few German phrases in return. Slowly, suspicion gave way to something quieter. Not quite trust, but a working understanding. In the village, opinions were divided. Some people thought it obscene to treat enemy soldiers with any kindness. Others saw practicality. The work needed doing. The prisoners were here whether anyone liked it or not, and gradually, something unexpected began to happen. The prisoners became familiar. Children playing near the fields would wave. A few farmers started inviting them inside for tea. One elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson, began bringing them cake on Sundays. Her husband had been killed in the First War. She knew what it meant to be far from home. By summer, the prisoners were working across a dozen farms in the area. They harvested wheat, tended livestock, repaired fences. Some were engineers or tradesmen and helped fix machinery. Others had medical training and assisted the village doctor when the clinic was overwhelmed. The boundaries began to blur. They were still prisoners, still guarded, but they were also neighbours in a strange, reluctant way. Richter became particularly close to the Whitley family. He worked harder than the others, arriving early, staying late. He had a wife and 2 daughters back in Germany. He hadn't heard from them in over a year. He didn't know if they were alive. Margaret noticed how his hands shook sometimes when he thought no one was watching. One afternoon, she brought him a letter she'd written in simple English. It said that when the war ended, if he needed help finding his family, she would try to assist. Richter read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. He thanked her in German. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the meaning. Not every story was gentle. In the neighbouring village of Royston, a prisoner tried to escape. He was caught within hours, cold and hungry, hiding in a barn. He was sent to a harsher camp up north. The incident reminded everyone that these men were still the enemy, that the war, though ending, had left wounds that wouldn't heal quickly. Some villagers never softened. They saw the prisoners as a necessary evil, nothing more. But others found something else, a reminder that beneath the uniforms and flags, there were just men, tired, broken men, trying to survive. By autumn, the war in Europe had been over for months. Japan had surrendered. The world was trying to piece itself back together. But the prisoners remained. Repatriation was slow. Germany was in ruins, divided, uncertain. Many prisoners didn't know where home even was anymore. The borders had shifted. Families were scattered. So they stayed in Britain, working, waiting. In Ashwell, Richter continued at Whitley's farm. The harvest that year was one of the best in a decade. Whitley credited the extra hands, but it was more than that. Richter had brought a kind of quiet determination to the work. He treated the land with care, as if it were his own. Whitley began to rely on him, not just for labour but for judgment. When a fence needed mending, he asked Richter's opinion. When a field needed rotating, they planned together. One cold November morning, a letter arrived for Richter. It had taken months to reach him, passed through Red Cross offices and military channels. His hands trembled as he opened it. It was from his wife. She and the girls were alive. They'd survived the bombing of Munich and fled to a village near the Austrian border. They were safe, thin, struggling, but alive. Richter sat down on the barn step and wept. Whitley found him there an hour later. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply placed a hand on Richter's shoulder and left him alone with his grief and relief. Christmas that year was strange. The prisoners were allowed to attend a small service in the village church. Some locals objected, but the vicar insisted. He preached about forgiveness, about the long road ahead. Richter sat in the back row, his cap in his hands. Margaret sat 3 rows ahead. Afterward, outside in the cold, she approached him. She'd knitted a scarf. She handed it to him awkwardly, saying it was cold and he needed it for the fields. Richter accepted it, his eyes wet. He told her, in halting English, that she had a kind heart, that the world needed more people like her. Repatriation orders finally came in early 1946. Richter and the others would be sent back to Germany in stages. The night before he left, Whitley invited him into the house. They sat by the fire, drinking weak tea. Whitley spoke about his son, killed at Dunkirk. He'd hated the Germans then, hated them with everything he had. But meeting Richter had changed something, not erased the loss, but softened it. Richter listened. He spoke about his own brother, killed on the Eastern Front, about the waste of it all, about how neither of them had wanted this war. They sat in silence for a long time, two old men on opposite sides of a finished fight, united by grief. The next morning, Richter and the others were loaded onto trucks. Villagers gathered to watch them leave. A few waved. Mrs. Patterson pressed a parcel of food into Richter's hands. Margaret stood beside her father, her scarf wrapped around her own neck now. Richter caught her eye and nodded. She nodded back. Then the trucks pulled away, rumbling down the lane toward the railway station. Richter returned to Germany to find his home destroyed. But he found his family. They rebuilt slowly, scraping by in the shattered economy. He never forgot Ashwell. He wrote to the Whitleys once, a short letter thanking them for their kindness. Whitley wrote back. They exchanged a few more letters over the years, brief updates, small kindnesses across the miles. In 1958, Richter returned to England. He'd saved for years. He wanted to see the farm again, to thank Whitley properly. He arrived unannounced, walking up the lane just as he had 13 years earlier. Whitley was in the yard, older now, slower. He looked up and didn't recognize the man at first. Then Richter smiled. Whitley's face broke into something between shock and joy. They embraced, two old men who'd once been enemies, now simply friends. Richter stayed for a week. He helped with the harvest, just like before. Margaret, now married with children of her own, invited him for dinner. They spoke about the war, but only a little. Mostly they spoke about life, about rebuilding, about the future. On his last day, Richter and Whitley stood in the North Field, the one they'd ploughed together in 1945. The wheat swayed in the breeze, golden and full. Whitley said it was the same field, same soil. But everything else had changed. Richter agreed. Everything had changed. Similar stories unfolded across Britain. Thousands of German and Italian prisoners worked the land during and after the war. Some returned home and never looked back. Others maintained friendships that lasted decades. A few even settled in Britain permanently, marrying local women, raising families. The relationships weren't always easy. Memories were long. Pain was real. But in the quiet spaces between bitterness and forgiveness, something human emerged. The children of Ashwell grew up hearing the story of the German prisoners who helped save the harvest. Some dismissed it as sentimentality. Others saw it as a reminder that even in the darkest times, decency could survive, that enemies could become neighbours, that a shared meal, a kind word, a moment of understanding could plant seeds that outlasted the war itself. By the time Whitley died in 1967, Richter had visited 3 more times. At the funeral, Margaret read a letter Richter had sent. It spoke of gratitude, of the kindness shown to a man who'd expected none. It spoke of the scarf, which his daughters still kept. It spoke of a friendship born from necessity, but sustained by choice. The last line stayed with those who heard it. Richter wrote that the war had taken much from him, his youth, his country, his certainty, but it had also given him something unexpected, the knowledge that even after everything, people could choose mercy over hatred, that a farmer in England could look at a broken German soldier and see not an enemy but simply another man, trying to find his way home. The fields around Ashwell still grow wheat. The barn where Richter first picked up a plough still stands, though it's been repaired and repainted many times. The village has changed, as all places do. But the memory remains, passed down in stories, in letters kept in attic boxes, in fading photographs of men standing side by side in a field, their sleeves rolled up, their faces tired but peaceful. It wasn't a grand story. No battles were fought there, no treaties signed, just a quiet chapter in a vast, terrible war, a chapter about prisoners and farmers, about suspicion giving way to respect, about the small, stubborn acts of kindness that persist even when the world tears itself apart, and about two men, born enemies, who discovered that hatred was a choice and so too was its opposite.